I'm frankly surprised to see so many people coming to hear a talk on cognitive functioning in a place that's so high functioning. I'm not sure you're going to learn all that much, but nonetheless, I'll see what I can tell you about the topic. I really do want to talk about cognitive functioning, but there are various talks that I could give about this because there are various ways of defining cognitive functioning. I could be talking about improving your perceptual abilities or improving your ability to pay attention to something when you're trying to attend to it, or improving your ability to memorize things. But what I want to concentrate tonight on is a very important aspect of cognitive functioning that I'm sure you all care about, and that is how we manage to reason and solve novel problems. Because after all, what we think about as human intelligence often amounts to the ability to solve problems and reason. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, psychologists often call this fluid intelligence, this ability to solve problems on your feet, in contrast to another kind of intelligence that we often think of called crystallized intelligence. You can think of crystallized intelligence as what you know about the world. So it consists of your vocabulary or my knowledge of how I get from the library back home or what my lab looks like at the university. It's the fount of knowledge that you have stored. And that's in contrast to what I want to talk about tonight, this ability to reason, which I will refer to as fluid intelligence. Now, it's widely known that fluid intelligence is often thought to be highly heritable. That is to say, a significant portion of the variation in fluid intelligence from one person to another person is governed by your genetic makeup. And some people often think that if something is highly heritable, that means it's unchangeable. But the first thing I need to convince you of in order to continue this talk tonight is that even though fluid intelligence might have a heritable component to it, it is changeable. Because heritability doesn't preclude environmental influence, and the one example that I think shows this the best is height. We know that height is obviously influenced by genetic factors, although I'll tell you a little secret, no one happens to know what the genetic path is that leads to various heights. Seems like an interesting fact. Nonetheless, we also know that height can be influenced by environmental things, say nutrition, right? That can easily influence height. So here's a case of a factor, a characteristic that is highly heritable, but nonetheless can be subject to environmental influences. And I'm going to bank on that fact in much of what I'm going to tell you tonight. So let me give you a couple of examples of problems that illustrate this ability to solve problems, this thing that we call fluid intelligence. There are various ways of measuring this, and I've brought along examples from just one way. This is an example of a problem that might appear on what's often called a matrix reasoning task, which is a measure of fluid intelligence. This actually happens not to be a problem on the test because I don't want to violate the confidence of the test. So what you would get in this problem is this. You'd get a matrix that looks like this, and your job is to figure out what item belongs in the empty space in that matrix. So if I look at this, I see on the top line, I see a triangle with horizontal lines, I see a diamond with horizontal lines, and I see a pentagon that's all shaded in. On the next line, I see a pentagon again with vertical lines. Now I see a triangle that's shaded in, and I see a diamond that has horizontal lines. So on the next line, I see the diamond that's shaded in and the pentagon with horizontal lines. So what do you think is missing? What's missing is a triangle, because that's the one shape that appears in the other two lines. And what kind of coloration does it have? Right, it would have vertical lines, and the triangle would be upright because the other triangles are upright. So the answer would be number 3 if you were choosing an answer from among those. So that's an example of a fairly easy problem, doesn't involve a lot of depth of reasoning. Here's an example I brought along from another test of matrix reasoning, happens to be German in nature, and this one is somewhat more challenging. Your job is to figure out, once again, what goes in the missing square. So think about it for a moment. Okay, I've given you your moment. What you have to realize in order to answer this problem is that it doesn't depend just on what the open square is. It depends on what its neighbors have. So you'll see here that every time there's a shape in the adjacent location on the adjacent square, there's an identical shape. So you see triangles, you see these gear things, you see these pentagon things. And so this one must have a gear thing that's shaded in, it must have a gear thing that's open, and it must have this open triangle. So that would be one of the answers, I guess, D there among the answers, the one in the lower left. Now you can see this kind of problem involves a substantially different kind of reasoning than the first one. You have to be able to store things in memory, you have to be able to plan out possible solutions, you have to have a short-term memory that's holding things for a brief period of time while you're looking at other elements of the problem, and we'll get back to these components as we go along. I just wanted to give you an example of some things that characterize fluid intelligence. So, what makes up fluid intelligence? I mean, I've given you examples of cases that illustrate the use of it, but I want to lay out a few components of it. One is you have to overcome reflexive behavior. That is, you might have a tendency just to pick an answer, and you've got to withhold picking that answer to think about it and scope out what the appropriate answer is. And that is an important component of fluid intelligence. Another is grit. You can't give up. Right? There are various people who are faced with these problems, and they just don't stick with it long enough. And that is an important component of fluid intelligence. By some people's estimation, grit turns out to be a more important predictor of school performance than other kinds of measured intellectual abilities. So it clearly is a component of what's going on here. You have to be able to shift your attention from one thing in mind to another thing in mind, or from one thing on the problem that you were looking at to another thing in the problem that you were looking at. But one way or another, you have to have this flexibility of attention that can shift back and forth. You have to overcome interfering information. So you might have been trying to solve that second problem, and your neighbor next door was elbowing you or saying something into your ear. That's irrelevant information. It's not going to help you solve the problem unless the neighbor was giving you the answer. And so overcoming irrelevant information is an important component. You have to be able to store information briefly, and I'm going to get back to this a little bit later on when we talk about the importance of short-term memory for fluid intelligence. And you have to be able to retrieve information from long-term memory, because there are things you know about stripedness of those figures, about the shapes of figures, in order to be able to solve problems like this and in order to be able to reason in the world at large. And finally, you've got to be able to plan. That is, most intellectual reasoning tasks require you to go more than one step ahead, so you can plan out a possible solution path. So, here's what I'm going to do this evening. One thing is, I want to review for you some interventions that have reasonably good evidence behind them showing that they do improve fluid intelligence. The second thing I want to do is to focus on one kind of intervention, cognitive training. After all, I'm giving this talk, and this work is done in my laboratory, and so I want to give you just a snippet of the kind of research we've done in my laboratory to look at the effectiveness of cognitive training. Now, what do I mean by cognitive training? Some of you may know this as commercially available products. How many have heard of Lumosity? Right. Lumosity is an example of a computerized game that's about cognitive training. Okay, so now that I've told you what I'm going to do, let me start doing it. How do you improve cognitive functioning? First, become an adult. Because it's widely known that from young adulthood to middle age, I used to call those ages, by the way, old age when I was younger. I no longer do. It's widely known that from young adulthood to middle age, there are various cognitive abilities that get better. And these cognitive abilities taken together compose this thing that we're calling fluid intelligence. Things like verbal memory, your ability to verbally reason, numeric ability, simple numeric ability, spatial orientation, and inductive reasoning. The one thing on this graph that gets worse, even from young adulthood to middle age, is your speed of processing. It's inevitable, you just get slower, and it starts about 20 years of age. And so that's the good news. The good news is if you become an adult, you're going to get smarter and smarter if smarts are measured by these kinds of abilities, and I think they are. Here's the bad news about getting older. As you then continue to age from 60 on, trust me, I'm as depressed about this as you all are. As you continue to age beyond 60, all of these cognitive abilities, not just perceptual speed, but all of these others as well, get worse. And that, again, is not inevitable, but it's certainly the epidemiological trend. So becoming an adult is a good thing to do if you want to improve your cognitive functioning, but if you're going to get older, don't do it without doing something about it. And what is it that you can do about it? Well, I'm going to give you some prescriptions that I think help, and these are the interventions that I think improve cognitive functioning. One is exercise aerobically. The data on the influence of aerobic exercise on cognitive function are simply incontrovertible. Nobody claims that this effect isn't real. Here's just one study. I could have picked hundreds of studies in order to illustrate this. This is a study in which they compared older adults who were sedentary versus older adults who were engaged in aerobic exercise of various sorts. And they looked at executive functioning, things like being able to plan or inhibit inappropriate responses, things like being able to make a choice when you have two alternatives to choose, spatial skills, speed of processing, and the data are clear. Aerobic exercise improves your cognitive ability on these and other skills as well. These are data taken not from older adults, but from adolescents, showing very much the same thing in a task that's got real-world consequences. These adolescents were placed on a treadmill that was non-motorized. In front of them, there was a large screen that showed an intersection. And their task was simply to cross the intersection without getting hit by the cars that are being shown on the screen going back and forth. And we're looking at lower fit adolescents and more highly fit adolescents, where fitness is measured by cardiovascular resistance. That is to say, the effects of aerobic exercise. Now, when there is no distraction in the environment, even then, the fit young kids did better than the unfit young kids. But when there was distraction in the environment, like music playing over headphones that they had on, or a hands-free telephone that was delivering information to them, then the difference between the unfit and the fit gets exaggerated. So here's a case where aerobic exercise not only has a main effect on performance, but it interacts with the effects of distraction, which I told you is an important component. Resisting that distraction is an important component of of fluid intelligence. Okay, so become an adult, do something about it, exercise aerobically, take drugs. There are two classes of drugs that have demonstrated effects on cognitive functioning. One class is antioxidants. Here are data taken from a widely known study called the Nurses' Health Study. This is a study. This cohort happened to be 15,000 women. It's called the Nurses' Health Study because the participants are either present or former nurses, and they chose nurses because nurses follow the instructions as they're being surveyed. They're very compliant. And these data show a number of cognitive tasks that were posed to the nurses in the study, some of whom were taking vitamin E and vitamin C supplements, and some of whom were not. And the ones who were taking them in various doses as well. So this is a telephone interview that asks the nurses about their own cognitive functioning, so it's a self-report. These two are a short-term and a long-term word memory test. These two bars represent another verbal memory test, but for passages. Here is a verbal fluency test, how quickly you can come up with words when you're trying to think of them. Here's a task in which you're given a set of digits and you have to repeat them backwards. You can see that most of these bars fall above the line that's present on that graph. That is to say, people who were taking vitamin E and vitamin C supplements in this study outperformed their non-supplement peers on a range of cognitive abilities. Again, this is just a subset of them. If you look here just at the global score, which adds these and other measures together, you see there is a global effect. I'll tell you a little secret from this study. They also looked at people who were taking just vitamin C or just vitamin E instead of the combination of E and C, and it turns out that C by itself doesn't do the trick. Vitamin E by itself does. And the E and C combination does a little bit better than just E alone, but not much. So when friends of mine know that I work in this general area, and they ask me, so, what can I do that's easy in order to improve my intellectual ability? And I tell them, eat blueberries. Blueberries and other similar fruits are very high in antioxidants, especially vitamin E. You can Google yourself what other antioxidant fruits and vegetables there are and come up with your own diet. I don't want to prescribe it. But there are data suggesting that this has an effect. So there's one class of drugs that's influential. The other class of drugs are stimulants. Now, people don't take stimulants routinely. They are most often prescribed to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, often starting at the pediatric level and then going into adulthood. And there are two classes of drugs that are often prescribed: methylphenidate, you might know it by the brand name Ritalin or Concerta, and dextroamphetamine, which is rampant on college campuses under the name Adderall. There are data that show that taking these drugs reduces hyperactivity, reduces impulsivity, and reduces inattention. And if you remember back to my early slide when I tried to define fluid intelligence, these are some of the characteristics of good intellectual functioning. You have to be able to avoid distraction, so you have to be able to pay attention, and you have to be able to act non-reflexively. That is, you want to reflect on what you're doing and not just act reflexively. And so here's one study that I took out of the literature showing that these stimulant medications enhance long-term memory. They have a modest effect on short-term memory, although other studies show that they have a bit of an effect. They do improve self-control in a variety of kinds of settings, not only in the school setting, but in the workplace and for other kinds of activities. And furthermore, these drugs tend to have a greater effect on individuals who are poorer performing to begin with. That is, ones who start with lower cognitive functioning. Okay, so take drugs. That's another prescription. Engage in specific training. So I mentioned Lumosity before. By the way, I have no financial interest in the company, so I don't care particularly that you buy that tool. There are lots of them that are available on the market. But the important thing about these is that they're teaching you specific skills. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So there are video games on the market. I myself don't play video games, and so I'm not intimately familiar with these, but every student I know does, and so I've gotten to know them by osmosis. There are video games that teach you reasoning abilities, because they're essentially problem-solving games, and there are other classes of video games that teach you speed. That is, you have to respond quickly, and you have to be able to perceive things on the screen quickly. Tetris, if you play Tetris, is an example of such a game. Blocks falling quickly, and you have to make decisions about them. Well, it turns out that if you practice reasoning games like these, and then you're tested on, say, these matrix reasoning tasks that I showed you before, if you practice reasoning games, you get better at matrix reasoning than if you practice speed games. Contrary-wise, if you practice speed games, you get better at other tests of cognitive speed, and you don't get better at reasoning games, suggesting that the skill that you practice then transfers to like skills that you want to implement in the world around you. Now, let me give you another example of this from a study that's been quite influential in the psychological literature. I'm sorry, I need to take you through the design of the study because it's important. This is a study, the acronym is ACTIVE. I can't tell you what it stands for because I forget it every single time. It's a reflection on my cognitive functioning. It's a very large-scale study of some 2,500 participants, 2,800 participants, funded by the National Institute of Health, and it lasted 10 years. The ACTIVE study just ended a couple of years ago, and so they're now, and all along the way, they've been publishing partial results, but they're now able to publish results from the full 10-year cohort. So this is one cohort of individuals who've been followed for 10 years. And here's what happened to them. First, their baseline cognitive performance was measured using a variety of tests. Then they're placed randomly into one of four groups. One group does nothing. They're just sent on their merry way. Another group is given training on various tasks of memory. A third group is giving training on various tasks of reasoning, sort of like the video games that I showed you on the last slide. Another is given training on various tests of speed, sort of like I showed you on the last slide. And that training lasts for 5 weeks. As I recall, it's two 1-hour sessions a week for a total of 5 weeks. After those 5 weeks are over, the experimenters assess their performance on a variety of skills. Then the participants go away. Some of them come back 11 months later and they get booster training on the skill that they learned to begin with. So the ones who were trained on memory get booster training on memory. The ones who were trained on reasoning get booster training on reasoning. The other group gets no booster training at all. And then they get an assessment after that, and then they're sent on their way again. And at about the 3-year mark, there's another booster session, same thing. You get boosted on the thing that you learned to begin with, versus a control group that doesn't get booster training. And finally, there are assessments at 3 years, at 5 years, and then the final assessment 10 years out. So let me show you what I think are fairly impressive data, one bit of fairly impressive data from this study. So I have on this slide 4 lines corresponding to the 4 groups. The control group is shown in black dots and the other 3 in various geometric shapes. And plotted along here is their baseline performance and then their performance various years out. You can see that at the very beginning, before they've started any training at all, everybody's performing about the same. They then get trained in their various groups, and here's the startling result. This is the group, this line represents the group that were trained on reasoning tasks. And here they're being tested on reasoning tasks as well. And you can see that there's a vast improvement in their performance, even on the post-test, and then lasting certainly to 5 years out and even to 10 years out. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. They were trained for 10 1-hour sessions in the beginning. Some of them got booster training, which it turns out helps a bit. Others got no booster training at all. They come back 5 years later, after they've been trained for just 10 hours, and they're showing persistent effects of that training. I find that a remarkable result, and a result that tells me that there is specificity of training and transfer of that training to like skills. If you train on reasoning tasks, you're going to get better on reasoning tasks. Okay, engage in specific training. Next thing on the list, enhance components of thinking. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, it turns out that in order to engage your fluid intelligence, there are various things that you need to do. You need, and I listed them on an earlier slide. You need to pay attention to the information that you're posed with. You need to have a good working long-term memory. You need to avoid distraction, and so on and so on. So here's the logic of what interested many people in the field, me among them. If we can isolate each of these components that go into this ability to reason and solve novel problems, and if we can take one of those components that's tightly related to fluid intelligence, if we can train that component so you get better at it, maybe we can then have an effect on training your fluid intelligence. Do you understand the logic? Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm decomposing fluid intelligence into component parts, and I'm asking, can I pick one of these component parts that's an important component of fluid intelligence and then train it up and then see whether that has an effect on your overall fluid intelligence? Well, that's the logic of what we did, and the component that we chose to focus on is short-term memory. What do I mean by short-term memory? You all have an intuitive understanding of what short-term memory is. Your ability to maintain information in an actively, easily retrieved state. So you get on Google and you look up a phone number for some hair salon that you want to go to, and you have to remember that number long enough to get to the telephone so you can dial the hair salon and then make an appointment. There's an example of short-term memory that's kind of a canonical example. Short-term memory has a limited capacity. As you know full well, if you look up on Google 4 hair salons, and then you try to remember the 4 numbers so you can dial them in turn to see who's got an earlier appointment, you're dead in the water. It's just not going to happen, because there's just so much that you can store in short-term memory at any one time. Now, short-term memory consists of more than just being able to store information. It's the ability to manipulate that information while it's in memory as well. And I'll give you an example of that if you just show me a little bit of patience for a moment. Turns out that short-term memory is highly correlated with fluid intelligence. Well, if it weren't, we wouldn't have chosen it for study, because the logic is we want to find a component that's importantly correlated with fluid intelligence, hoping that if we train that component, we can train fluid intelligence. And I'll tell you how highly correlated it is in a moment. So the logic is, if we can train short-term memory, maybe we can have an effect on improving fluid intelligence. And as I say, this is based on this idea of common cognitive components. That is, there are components that make up fluid intelligence. We're isolating one of them that we think is important, trying to boost your ability to have that skill, and then seeing whether, when we put that component back in, that has an effect on improving your fluid intelligence. So, how do we train short-term memory? Here's a task that we invented that trains short-term memory on steroids. This is a schematic of the task, and I have to kind of walk you through it so you get a sense of what a participant in one of our experiments does. On the top line here, I'm showing you schematics of visual screens that are present on a computer that the subject looks at that contain each of them one spatial location that's marked by a white square that appears haphazardly. The participant can't anticipate what square is going to be lighted up. So it might be the lower right, it might be the lower left, it might be the lower right, someplace in the middle. They're essentially random. At the same time that these screens are appearing, one after another, paced about 3 seconds per screen, so it's about the pacing, a little bit slower than the pacing of my hand right now. They have earphones on, and coming in over the earphones are a sequence of one letter at a time, at the same pacing, one every 3 seconds. The letter C, the letter P, the letter C, the letter T, and so forth. Here's what the participant has to do in this task. The task is to decide for each visual stimulus that comes up and for each auditory stimulus that comes up over the earphones, whether it matches the one that was presented N items ago. So let me just give you an example of this. Let's say the N is 2. So, well, I can't answer the question for the first one or the second one because I don't know what happened before it, but let's take a look at the third event here. The third event consists of a square presented in the lower right-hand corner, and it consists of the letter C that you heard over a headphone. And your task is to decide, does that square appear in the same location as the square that appeared 2 items ago? Well, 2 items ago is there. Answer is yes. And at the same time that you make that decision, which you make by pressing a key with your left hand, with your right hand you're pressing a key to decide whether this letter matches the one that was presented 2 items ago. So the answer is yes. But the two are independent judgments. Sometimes it can be yes and no, sometimes no and yes, sometimes no and no. They're completely independent of one another. So let's look at this trial here. Here, you're doing a 2-back task. What's the right answer for the spatial location? No, because it doesn't match this one. And here, for that letter, the answer is no, because it doesn't match this one. But if we look at this last one here, the answer is no for the spatial location, but yes for the letter. Right? You following? This task is taxing when it's done at 2-back, but now I have to tell you the secret behind the experiment. The secret behind the experiment is that as you get better at this task, and I'll show you in a moment that you do get better at this task radically, N gets larger. So when you get to 70% accuracy at 2-back, we switch it to 3-back. When you get to 70% accuracy at 3-back, we go to 4-back. Now, if you get worse, if you get, I don't remember what the criterion is, say 50% accurate, I don't remember exactly what it is, we'll drop you down again. So it's constantly tracking your level of performance. So the level of challenge is what's kept constant, right? N is changing up and down, but it's the challenge of the task that's staying constant. Okay. Now, an important fact, and we would not have invented this task if we hadn't discovered this fact, the correlation between performance on this N-back task and fluid intelligence is 0.55. Now, 0.55 may not mean much to you, but when psychologists see a correlation of 0.55, they dance in the streets. I mean, correlations vary from 0 to 1. 0.55 for a complex skill like fluid intelligence is remarkably high. Okay, so we designed an experiment using this NBAC task that looked to see whether we could train this skill. And the experiment had just a very simplistic design. First, we gave all the participants, these happened to be young adults, a pretest on one of these matrix reasoning tasks that I described for you earlier. Then there were two groups of subjects that were, one group was trained for a week on NBAC in the way that I described for you. As you got better, it got harder. And the other group was a control group. It didn't do anything, just rested for a week. And then, after the week was over, we gave them a post-test on another matrix reasoning task. And so one group is trained for 1 week, another group is trained for 2 weeks, another group is trained for 3 weeks, and finally another group is trained for 4 weeks. Each group compared to a control condition that is resting for a comparable period of time. Now, here are the training data, and these data should convince you that you get better at NBAC with training. Here's N, and here's where people start, these young adults, about 3 back, and they get better and better and better each day, whether they're training for just 8 days or 12 days or 17 days or 19 days, they continue to get better. So you can improve your working memory. Now the question is, does this have transfer to fluid intelligence? Because after all, that's what we were designing our experiment to elicit. And here are what we call the transfer effects. Let's concentrate first on the left here. Here, before training, we compare the control group against the training group, and we find that their number of correctly solved matrix reasoning problems is about the same. But after training, the ones who got trained on the working memory task are doing better than the ones who didn't get that working memory training. And if we turn to the right side of the slide, what you see is that the amount of training you get, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, is directly related to the amount of improvement you show in fluid intelligence. The more training on working memory, the better your fluid intelligence gets. That was an experiment with younger adults. We've since done the same experiment with children and with older adults. And since I didn't anticipate having children in the audience, but I did anticipate having adults at least of my vintage, I brought along some data from older adults. And here we're measuring a control group, a group that got 10 days of training, a group that got 20 days of training, and we measure their improvement on short-term memory. And sure enough, the groups that were trained were better on short-term memory than the groups that weren't trained. Gee, if that hadn't happened, we really would have been depressed, because after all, we're training short-term memory. The important result is this one. Here we're measuring reasoning skill using these matrix reasoning tasks, and in fact, I'll tell you other tests of fluid intelligence as well, and the more you train, the more improvement you get. In this experiment, the improvement of the 10-day training group versus the control is modest, but the group that trained for 20 days shows a healthy improvement in fluid intelligence. It may be that older adults need more training than younger adults in order to show comparable benefits. Okay. Here's a little-known fact that turns out to be quite important for effects like this. You know, I told you in the very beginning that many people believe that intelligence is heritable and has got a very strongly heritable component to it. And it's sort of heavily governed by your genetic makeup. And some people believe because of that, you know, I've got what I've got, and I just can't change it. That is, my intelligence is fixed. And, you know, that's it. But other people believe that, sure, they might know that there's a heritable component to it, but nonetheless, they've got this abiding belief that it's changeable. And it turns out that what you believe about fluid intelligence has an effect on these training effects. Here are some data that we gathered where we trained people from 1 to 17 sessions, and we first measured how much they believed intelligence was malleable, that is changeable, and how much they believed it was fixed. The red line shows the people who believed it was fixed, and the blue line shows the people who believed that it was changeable. And sure enough, the people who believed that it was changeable showed more of a training effect than the people who believed it was fixed, even though both groups start at about the same place. Not only that, but if you look then at a measure of fluid intelligence, the subjects who thought, the individuals who thought that fluid intelligence was changeable showed more of an improvement in their fluid intelligence than the ones who thought it was fixed. In short, you have to believe. That is, you have to believe that it's malleable in order to show a substantial effect of these training programs. Okay. Finally, I'm going to finish with this one. Stimulate your brain. Now, when I say stimulate your brain, I don't mean in the sense of doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku or the jumble game that my wife and I play in the daily newspaper. Instead, I actually mean stimulate your brain. Electricity. Here is a participant in one of our experiments. Actually, I'll tell you the truth. This is a graduate student I'm working with at the University of California, Irvine, who has strapped to his head 2 electrodes. One roughly over the right portion of the frontal lobes of his brain, and one right over his left eye. The configuration of these electrodes makes a difference. One of them is an anode, that is, it's a positively charged, it's a positive terminal, and the other is a cathode, it's a negative terminal. And what we do is, once the participant is hooked up, we then turn on a very low current, like milliamperes, just 1 or 2 milliamps, and we keep it on for 20 or 25 minutes. And there is current flow in the brain as a function of this stimulation. I can tell you these wires are connected to the equivalent of a 9-volt battery. In fact, I'm sad to say, you can Google what's called transcranial direct current stimulation, which is what this is, and they'll show you how to make one of these devices for $50. And I'm sad to say that because people are home making these without knowing the science and without observing the safety constraints that are important. So we connect a participant to this device, and then we give them a task that's a simplified version of the NBAC task that I showed you before. In this case, just the spatial version. There are no letters coming in over the earphones. But fundamentally, it's the same task. As the subject gets better, it gets harder. As he gets worse, it gets easier. And here are the data. Here's a group of subjects. We train them for 7 sessions in this experiment, and here's their average NBAC level that they achieve. And these subjects are not getting stimulation. They have the electrodes strapped to their head, and we turn them on very briefly so that they get a sensation of kind of tickling, which is what it feels like when it first gets turned on. But then we turn it off, and we don't stimulate them for 20 minutes. And sure enough, they show an improvement in N, and that's just the same as what I showed you before. When you train people on working memory, they get better at working memory. Here are the subjects who had the electrodes turned on. And you can see that over 7 training sessions, they start off at about the same place, and the subjects who have the electrodes turned on show a dramatic improvement over the subjects who don't have the electrodes turned on. That result to us was stunning enough. But we then went on to do the following. These participants then left the lab after their 7 days of training, and we called them up 5 months later and asked them to come back in the lab and do NBAC again, just 1 session of NBAC. And then they left the lab again, no stimulation, and then we brought them back nearly a year later, and we had them do NBAC again. This is without any intervening stimulation. The only stimulation they've gotten is in the beginning of the experiment, if they got stimulation for those 7 sessions. And here are the data from those 2 follow-ups. These are the subjects who were stimulated 5 months ago compared to the subjects who had no stimulation. These are the subjects who were stimulated nearly a year ago compared to the subjects who had no stimulation. And you can see that these effects that are trained up over a very short period of time seem to have quite lasting consequences. And the importance of this is obvious, because if you can have a lasting effect on cognitive skills, then this is a phenomenon that's got legs. You might consider it as an important intervention. Okay, so let me summarize in 2 slides. What we know. We know that there are various factors that can lead to improvements in cognition. I described some of them to you. We know that cognitive training produces specific effects, like the active study showed and like our studies of working memory show. We know that cognitive training can also produce generalized effects in the sense that if you train working memory, you can get other effects on other cognitive skills. I have to tell you, this is a controversial area. Some people don't believe that conclusion. There is a large literature on this by now. I'm a believer because I've done some of these studies myself, and we've done meta-analyses of large-scale studies in the literature to convince ourselves of the effect. We know that these training effects can last a long time if we do the tests of fluid intelligence after a period of time, which I didn't show you particularly here tonight, but we have data about that. Here's what we don't know. The list of things we don't know is much larger than the list of things we know. We don't know, the research that's been done on training programs, for example, has concentrated on one niche or another niche. We've studied short-term memory. Other people have studied training arithmetic abilities. There are lots of training programs. Other people have studied using video games. Other people have studied products like Lumosity. And we don't know which of these training programs is effective over the long term. This includes the study of age on the effectiveness because age may interact with which programs are effective. Older adults may be more susceptible to certain kinds of training than younger adults are, and that children are. We need to look at individual differences in susceptibility to training. Now, I told you about one, how much you believe that intelligence is malleable, but we know there are other such effects as well, like motivation, for example. If you're not motivated to train, you're not going to show much of an effect. A graduate student who's working with me now is doing his dissertation on precisely that topic. We need to look at different training outcomes. We've limited ourselves in our work to fluid intelligence because we thought it was an important outcome. And other people have limited themselves to other outcomes, but we need to have a more ecumenical view than that in order to capture the breadth of the phenomenon. We need to determine other influences that have an effect. Stress, for example, other environmental things which can interact with the various things like drugs and aerobic exercise and cognitive training. We need to test intervention programs in non-laboratory settings. After all, if we can only get these in the laboratory, we're going to have very little impact on the population. We have to find out what scales up. And the people who invest in these commercial programs like Lumosity, Posit Science, CogMed, all these ones that you can buy for a few $100s, they're looking at this issue of what scales up to large populations. We need to combine interventions with known effects. For example, maybe the effect of aerobic exercise paired with cognitive training is greater than the effect of either one of them alone. And finally, we need to understand better what's actually happening in the brain. And so there are large numbers of brain studies, of which I'm doing some in my laboratory, in order to investigate these things. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.